Hello and welcome to the second presentation for the syntax seminar. This week we're going to start to introduce a theory of phrase structure known as X-bar theory. X-bar theory is an extremely restrictive but very simple theory. And before we start, it's worthwhile making a few comments about theories and restrictive theories in particular. One question that you might wonder about is why do we need theories? Well, theories are essentially inescapable. You can't avoid having a theory. In fact, you can't avoid having a theory in anything you do, let alone in science. Theories are simply just sets of assumptions that we make about the way things work. And we always make assumptions about things that happen in the universe, otherwise we wouldn't be able to actually operate. You have to assume that buses run on schedule, otherwise there'd be no point in going to a bus stop waiting for a bus to come. In science, however, theories are a lot more central because that is essentially what science is all about. Science is an investigation of what assumptions are actually the correct assumptions to make and how accurate the assumptions that we make about things really are. So we want to make such assumptions explicit. In everyday life, our assumptions about the way things work tend to be rather in the background, enabling us to function, but without really very much being questioned or tested to see how accurate they are. But in science, that's exactly what it's all about. We want to test our assumptions, we want to make them explicit to see what they actually are, and then obviously alter them, modify them if they turn out to be not as accurate as we would have hoped. So that's why we need a theory for a start. As I say, theories are just inescapable things. They're just assumptions that we have to make about the way things work, and we test those theories in science to see how accurate they are and modify them otherwise. What about restrictive theory? What's the point of a restrictive theory? Well, if you think about it, a theory that was unrestricted would allow for anything. It would allow for any eventuality to happen. Therefore, if we make observations and something happens, the theory says, yes, that could have happened, because the theory could allow anything to have happened. But why did that happen? Well, on that, the theory is not going to be able to tell you very much, because according to that theory, anything else might have happened. And so why a particular thing actually did happen, the theory has nothing to say about it. On the other hand, a restrictive theory doesn't allow anything to happen, it only allows certain things to happen. So if we make our observations and lo and behold those certain things do actually happen, then we could say that, well, that theory explains why it happened, because the theory, being as it is it won't allow anything else to happen. Okay, so our theory, therefore, the set of assumptions about the way things work, turns out to be an explanatory theory. And obviously, explanation is an important part of science. It leads to our understanding of the way things actually are. Okay, so let's make a start and look at X-bar theory. As I said, X-bar theory is an extremely simple theory. In fact, X-bar theory only has 3 rules. We're going to be looking at the first of those rules this week. X-bar theory comes in 2 parts. It comes in the X part and it comes in the bar part. And this week we're just going to be looking at the X part, and we'll expand it next week and be able to look at other rules by talking about the bar part. But for now, we'll just skip over that. The first rule of X-bar theory, as you can see, is basically a phrase structure rule of the kind we were looking at last week. It has an arrow, and to the left of the arrow we have a symbol, and to the right of the arrow we have some more symbols. And essentially this is an instruction of how to draw part of a phrase structure tree. The element that comes to the left is drawn at the top, Those to the right are drawn underneath, and we link them together with branches of the tree. Okay, so essentially this is just a phrase structure rule, but it's different from the kinds of phrase structure rules we were looking at last week. Those are very specific phrase structure rules that tell us how a noun phrase might look, and a verb phrase might look, and a preposition phrase. And in order to do that, we used category labels like N and V and P and A, etc., etc. But an X-bar rule uses letters like X and Y, and that differs from phrase structure rules of the more specific kind because X and Y are what we call category variables. They stand for any category. So X could apply to nouns, or X could apply to verbs, and X could apply to adjectives, or in fact any category that there is. That's why this rule is a very general rule. It's not a rule that tells us about any specific phrase, it's something that tells us about all phrases. And in fact, X-bar theory isn't just a theory of the phrase structure of English either, it's a theory of the phrase structure of all languages. Hence, it's an extremely general theory. Okay, how does it work then? As I said, X is a variable that could stand for any category. Let's suppose it stands for a noun. Well, as you can see, in the rule, we have an X on both sides of the arrow. Now, within a particular rule, and we'll see the same thing happens in the other rules of X-bar theory, anything that is represented by the same letter means that it must have the same category. So if X is a noun, then the XP must be a noun phrase. And of course, if X is a verb, the XP must be verb phrase. Okay? So whatever X stands for, the X on both sides of the arrow, the one with the XP and the one with the X, have the same category. Now this element is a very important element in the structure. It's known as the head. So X is the head of the phrase, and the head of the phrase is like the central element, the core element of the phrase. And that's because the consequence of stating the rule like this, where the X is the same on both sides, leads to the conclusion that every phrase contains a head. Okay, so every noun phrase has a noun, every verb phrase has a verb, every preposition phrase has a preposition. Now, while that may not sound entirely surprising, it wasn't always believed that every phrase has a head. And in fact, X-bar theory is the first theory to have actually made this proposal that this is one restriction on phrases. All phrases have heads. Okay, so how does this actually work then? If we've got one general rule about all phrases, how do we know about specific phrases? Well, that all depends on what the head is. The head is actually a word position. So in the head position, we're going to put words. Now, words have properties. Words have properties like pronunciations. You've got to know how to pronounce a word. They have meanings. You've got to know what the word means. But words also have category properties. That is, you've got to know where in a structure you can put them, in a noun position or a verb position. Now, all this information about words is something that you have to learn to learn a language. And that information is stored in what we refer to as the lexicon. The lexicon is like a huge dictionary about all of the information you know about words. So, for example, the word man has a pronunciation, it's man. It has a meaning, male, adult, human, and it has a category, it's a noun. Verb, on the other hand, is pronounced hit is pronounced hit. It means to make forceful contact with, and it's a verb, etc., etc. And all that information and more is stored in your lexicon, the place where you store this information about words. Okay, so we're going to insert a word into a head position because that is a word position in the phrase. Suppose we insert man into the head position. Well, as I said, one thing we know about man is that it's a noun. Now, if they've got a noun in the X position, then the X is an N, a noun. And as we've seen, that if the head is N, then the whole phrase is an N. So what you can see is that this categorical information is passed up into the structure from the word that you insert into the head position. This relationship, which links all the categories up into the structure, is known as projection. We say that the head projects its category onto the phrase, and ultimately the head's category is projected from the lexical item that sits in the head position. Okay, so now let's look at the second aspect of this rule. Alongside the head, we've got another phrase, a Y phrase. That's called the complement. Okay, and what do we know about the complement? Well, the complement is a phrase. So while the head is a word position, the complement is a phrase position within the phrase headed by the head. It's also represented with a category variable. Y is a category variable, can stand for any category. But unlike the X and the XP in the rule, it's represented by a different letter. And as I said, things that are represented by the same letter have the same category. So X and XP will be the same. But YP is a different letter, and therefore it doesn't have to be the same as X. It's totally unconnected to X in terms of its category. That doesn't mean to say, however, that it must be different from X. It just means that it's independent from X. So whatever X is has no necessary bearing on whatever Y is in this rule. Okay, YP is a phrase, and therefore the same rule that affects XP also applies to Y. So Y, being a phrase, must have a head of the same category of whatever Y is, and therefore, and also it can have a complement of its own. So you can see then that the rule is going to be able to be used recursively to produce more and more categories. Okay, we'll refer to the complement of YP here as ZP, just so as we don't get confused. Okay, but you can see this more or less conforms to exactly the same rule as XP does. Now that says that an XP contains an X and a phrase that follows it, and here we've got a YP with a Y with a phrase that follows it. So the same rule can apply and produce larger and more complex structures as we proceed. The other thing to notice about the complement is that it's in brackets. So that means something, and what that means is that the complement is an optional element of the phrase. While the head is an obligatory element, every phrase has a head, not every phrase has to have a complement. So that means that we can have a phrase which is made up of just the head without the complement. So that's a possibility according to the rule. We have a one-word phrase, but that word must be the head, i.e. the same category as the phrase itself. Alternatively, you can give a complement to the head and then there will be a phrase following the head. Now, what is it that determines the category of the phrase? Well, again, this comes down to the head. Different heads select for different complements. And so actually the head determines what the complement category is going to be. We call this relationship between the head and the complement selection. We say that the head selects for its complement. and therefore the head really is the central element of the whole phrase, because not only does the head determine the category of the phrase itself through projection, it also determines what the complement is going to be, whether there's going to be a complement there or not, and certainly what the category of the complement is going to be through this notion of selection. To have a look at how this works, let's have a look at a concrete example. To start with, the verb phrase is a very good one to show the relationship between the head and its complement. Now, you've probably heard of the distinction between what we call an intransitive verb, like the verb to leave, or a transitive verb, like the verb to love. Essentially, the difference is that intransitive verbs don't have objects, whereas a transitive verb has an object. So in a sentence like John left, there's no object following the verb, whereas in a sentence like John loves Mary, Mary is the object. Now, in X-bar terms, an object is simply the complement of the verb. In particular, it's a noun phrase complement. That's essentially what the definition of an object is, a noun phrase complement of a verb. Okay, so loves is a transitive verb, leave is an intransitive verb. Love has an object, a noun phrase complement, leave doesn't. Okay, so therefore we've got leave, the verb phrase headed by the verb to leave, is just a one-word phrase with leave as the head of that phrase. Love, on the other hand, is a verb that has a complement, which is a noun phrase. Now, that's not the only two kinds of verbs that we can have. There are other kinds of verbs too. For example, there are the kinds of verbs which are followed by preposition phrases. In other words, the kind of verb that has a preposition phrase complement, sitting in that position following the verb. So here we've got a VP headed by the verb to reach, and there is a preposition phrase following it. Furthermore, we can have verbs which are followed by sentences, okay, that take sentences as their complements. John thinks he should leave is a complement, is a sentence that follows the verb to think as its complement. So this is a verb that takes a sentence as a complement. So we can see there are all sorts of different types of verbs, and the types of verbs are determined by what complements they take. Those that take no complement, those that take a noun phrase complement, an object, those that take a preposition phrase complement, those that take sentence complements. They all differ in terms of what their complement is. And obviously, what the complement is depends on the verb. The verb reach has a preposition phrase complement, the verb think has a clausal complement, the verb love has a noun phrase complement, and the verb leave has no complement. So each verb determines what the nature of its complement is going to be, whether there's going to be one or not, and if there is one, what its category is going to be. Now again, that's information that must be stored about each individual word in every element inside your lexicon, the part of your knowledge of language which tells you about the way words are. So, as part of our information that we know about the verb to leave, we know that it has no complement. We represent that in terms of this part of the lexical entry of the verbs, where we say that this is basically the kind of verb we've got, or to put it in more technical terms, the subcategory of the verb. Okay, so this thing inside the square brackets tells us that leave is a verb which is followed by no complement. And the entry for love says that this is a verb which is followed by an NP complement, and reach is followed by a preposition phrase complement, etc., etc., etc. So for every verb that you know, you've got to learn what its subcategory is, in terms of which kind of complement it selects for. So one question that arises is that given a phrase, how do you know what the head is? Now, that may seem obvious in some cases, but it can be a bit more tricky in others. So we need to establish methods of how to determine what the head of a phrase is. So, for example, take something like this. It's a phrase with two words in it. One's a preposition and the other one's a noun. So, is it a preposition phrase or is it a noun phrase? Which one of these two words is the head? If it's a preposition phrase and the head is the preposition, then it seems as though the noun element there is sitting in the complement position, following the head. And if it's a complement, we know that complements are phrases. So really, this isn't just a noun, it's a noun phrase. On the other hand, if it's a noun phrase, then the preposition is sitting in a position that we've not really seen before as yet, so not much can be said about the preposition. So we'll just assume that it's a preposition in front of the noun head. Now, one way to answer the question of how do we know which of these is correct, is the preposition the head or is the noun the head, is to have a look at the whole phrase and see, well, which does it behave like? Does it behave like a noun phrase or does it behave like a preposition phrase? One aspect of the behaviour of phrases is the positions you can find them in other structures. The set of positions where you can find an element in a structure is called its distribution. So the question is, does this phrase distribute like a preposition phrase? Does it go in the positions where preposition phrases go, or does it distribute like a noun phrase? If we take a sentence like this, we can see part of the distribution of noun phrases. Here we've got two positions where we can find a noun phrase. The Mary is sitting in the object position, that's the complement of a transitive verb like love, and John is in the subject position. So those are two places where we can get noun phrases. The question is then, can our phrase sit in either of those? But if you try to put to London in these positions, the result ends up as being ungrammatical. You can't say John loves to London or to London loves Mary. So it looks then as though this phrase doesn't distribute like a noun phrase, and therefore we can come to the conclusion that it probably isn't a noun phrase. Now, given that, as we've said, X-bar theory argues that every phrase must have a head, and given that the noun doesn't seem to be the head of this because it isn't a noun phrase, then the conclusion we come to then is that it's the preposition that is the head, and so it's a preposition phrase. But that's a rather indirect way of arguing for it based on a number of theoretical assumptions. You might want to find out whether or not we can actually find direct evidence that this is indeed a preposition. One way of looking at this is to see whether or not you can replace a phrase with a one-word element. Now, we've seen a one-word element is a phrase that contains just the head. So if we can see a phrase with just the head in it, we know exactly what that phrase is because the head determines the category of the phrase. Okay, so the question is, can we replace a phrase like to London with a single word, and what word is that? Let's have a look at this sentence here. John went to London. That gives us part of the distribution of this phrase. It can go here after a verb like to go. Now, what can we replace that phrase with? Well, you can't replace it with a noun. You can't say John went London. Okay, so again, that's confirmation that this phrase is not a noun phrase. So the question is, can you replace it with a preposition? And indeed you can. You can say John went out. Out is a preposition. It's one word in a phrase, so the whole phrase must be a preposition phrase. So there we've got direct evidence that this phrase is a preposition phrase. Okay, so what we've just demonstrated then is two different tests for determining what the head of a phrase is. One of them we can refer to it as the distribution test, and that goes something like this, that if a phrase distributes like phrases of a particular category, call that category X, then it's an XP and the head is of the same category as X. Okay, so if it distributes like a noun phrase, the head is going to be a noun. If it distributes like a preposition phrase, the head of it's going to be a preposition. The other test is the replacement test. So can you replace the phrase with a one-word element? If so, then that word is the head of the phrase, and we know therefore what the category of the phrase is by looking at the category of the word that replaces it. Okay, so with all this in mind, let's now turn to what we've been calling the noun phrase and ask the question, is the noun really the head of the noun phrase? Now, many noun phrases can contain two words, a determiner in front and a noun following it. So we ask the question here, is this a noun phrase and the determiner is something else? Or is the determiner the head of the phrase, in which case it would be a determiner phrase? So let's apply some of the tests that we've looked at, and let's see what the distribution of this thing is. Well, if we take a sentence where we can find our noun phrase, a table would look good in this room. A table is sitting there in that subject position, that first position, which is the position of this kind of phrase. So can you replace it with a single noun? And can you replace it with a single determiner? Well, obviously you can replace it with a single noun. Basically, plural nouns don't have to appear alongside a determiner, and then that can go in exactly the same position. So besides having a table would look good in this room, you can say tables would look good in this room. So you can replace the phrase with a single noun. Not so with the determiner. You can't replace a table with a, because otherwise you get something like would look good in this room, and clearly that is ungrammatical. So it looks as though the results of the test are fairly straightforward. You can replace such a phrase with a single noun, and therefore the noun should be the head, and this whole thing is a noun phrase, as we've already said. However, let's have a look at another sentence. Here we've replaced the phrase with another single word, and this word is a pronoun, and that's perfectly okay. It would look good in this room. And the question that needs to ask then is, what category does a pronoun belong to? You would think that the name gives it away. It's a pronoun, so it's a kind of noun, and in which case we've just confirmed what we've said earlier. But names are not always the best way to recognise something on, because names are rather randomly given at times. For example, we call a thing a strawberry, even though that's got nothing to do with straw, and biologically it isn't even a berry. So its name has been given it in a rather random fashion. Just because this thing is called a pronoun does not necessarily mean to say that it is a noun. We need some proper evidence about this. Okay, so one piece of evidence that a determiner is a noun is its distribution. Does it distribute like a noun? Can we find it in those positions where we find nouns? Well, we know that nouns can typically go after a determiner. Okay, so that's one place where we can find a noun. Is that a place where we can find a determiner? Well, you might say, this isn't going to be a reliable test because there are some nouns that don't go very well with a determiner. For example, proper names don't often appear with determiners, but even proper names like things like Albert, for example, they can, under the right circumstances, be preceded by a determiner. For example, you could say, he's not the Albert he used to be, or there's some Albert looking for you, or an Albert is what we need right now. So it's possible to get a determiner in front of a noun, even those nouns which don't typically appear alongside determiners. In fact, when one looks at other languages, you can find that such nouns like proper nouns are often accompanied by determiners. In some dialects of Hungarian, for example, it's very typical to come across a proper noun preceded by a determiner. So you can say, O János meghívta az érzsit. So, O János, the John, and the Elizabeth, or something like that. So you can find determiners very normally in front of nouns. This is a fact about English, that most proper nouns don't usually get accompanied by determiners. And in fact, there are languages where not only can you get a determiner in front of a proper noun, but it's also obligatory to. You can't not have a determiner. This is Greek, and in Greek, you've got to introduce noun phrases with a determiner. You can't just say, John invited Elizabeth. You've got to say, the John invited the Elizabeth, and it would actually be ungrammatical to miss out the determiner. However, in all of these languages, you never get a determiner accompanying a pronoun. You can't say, he's not the him he used to be, or there's some him looking for you, or a he is what we need right now. In fact, if we look at those other languages, exactly the same pattern emerges. In Hungarian, you can't say az ő meghívta az őt. Whether or not you can say o János, if your dialect allows that, nobody allows az ő. And similarly with Greek, where you have to have a determiner in front of a noun, you cannot have a determiner in front of a pronoun. So that would seem to suggest then that determiners are not nouns. They don't distribute like nouns. In fact, when we look at the distribution of pronouns, we find they're actually in complementary distribution with determiners. Wherever you can get a determiner, you can't get a pronoun, and vice versa. Wherever you get a pronoun, you can't find a determiner. So you can say the girls left, but you can't say she girls left. You can say they left, but you can't say the left. Okay, so we have here a pattern whereby one thing can appear but the other one can't, and in those places where the other one can appear, the first one can't. That's known as complementary distribution. Now, linguists often take observation of complementary distribution to indicate that the reason why the two things can't appear together is because they need to occupy exactly the same structural position. Now, given that it's the category of an element that determines its distribution, which position it can appear in, given that these two elements are in complementary distribution and therefore trying to occupy the same position, we're led to the conclusion that they must also therefore be of the same category. If they sit in the same position, they must have the same category. So our conclusion is then that pronouns are in fact determiners, not nouns at all. This can also be supported by the fact that there are lots of different things that can behave both as a determiner and as a pronoun. So, for example, the word many, you can say many girls, where it behaves like a determiner, but you can also say many, as in many left. Some girls left and some left. Few girls left, few left. Most girls left, most left. All of these words can therefore seem to function both as a determiner and as a pronoun, again establishing a connection between the two. And finally, there are some pronouns, not many, but some pronouns where it can be used like a determiner. For example, the pronoun we can often be used like a determiner by something like we scientists, and you is also another pronoun that can behave like a determiner, as in you fools. So we scientists warned you fools years ago about global warming or something like that. So all of the evidence then that we've got would seem to suggest that pronouns are of the category determiner, not nouns. However, that leaves us with a bit of a problem. We've seen that there are phrases that contain a single noun, and there are phrases that contain a single determiner, i.e. a pronoun. And they look like this. So we've got, say, plural nouns like tables can appear in the same position as other phrases of this kind, and so can a pronoun. Now, if as we've argued, the phrase is the same as its head, and if the only word that is available in the phrase is just this either noun or pronoun, then it must be that tables is a noun phrase and him is a determiner phrase. But that can't be, because these two things have exactly the same distribution. A phrase consisting of just a plural noun will go in exactly the same position as a phrase consisting of a pronoun. So those two things have to have the same category because they have the same distribution. They go in exactly the same structural positions. But if they both have the same category, and say, for example, we say that category is noun phrase, then the phrase that contains the pronoun has the wrong head. It has a determiner as the head, and X-bar theory says all phrases have to have a head of the appropriate category because it's the head that determines the nature. So if we say these two things are DPs, determiner phrases, then we've got a problem with the noun head, because there we've got a DP headed by a noun. So whichever way you try to manipulate this, you're going to end up with something that is inconsistent with the assumptions that we've made so far. Now, there is a way of solving this puzzle by looking at another aspect of noun phrases called the definiteness property of them. We know that noun phrases can either be definite or indefinite. For example, in these examples, we've got a table, and that's an indefinite phrase, and the table, which is a definite phrase. It's fairly clear that the definiteness property here is coming from the determiner, because that's the thing that differs in both cases. A is the indefinite determiner, and the is the definite determiner. And a phrase that has an indefinite determiner in it is indefinite, and a phrase that has the definite determiner is definite. But what about phrases that don't have a determiner? There are two kinds like this. One is proper nouns, names like John, and the other, as we've seen, is the plural nouns, like tables. Now, intuition tells us that a phrase like John is a definite phrase, and a phrase like tables is indefinite. But we can actually demonstrate this because there are some sentences where we find only indefinite phrases. For example, there's a man at the door. We've got a man in this place after the verb to be. That turns out to be a place where you can only get an indefinite phrase, like a man. You can't replace it with the man. You can't say there's the man at the door. Now, we can see that John is definite, therefore, because that's just as ungrammatical. You can't say there is John at the door. But you can fill that position there with a plural noun, like tables, as in there are tables in the room. Okay, so it seems then we've got evidence that proper nouns form definite phrases, whereas plural nouns form indefinite phrases when they don't appear with determiners. So where's the source of the definiteness in these cases? It doesn't seem to be a determiner because there isn't a determiner, but it's problematic to say that these things, that the definiteness is coming from the nouns. Just like the noun table can go alongside an indefinite and definite determiner, that would indicate that the noun itself is neither definite nor indefinite. It's compatible with either of those things. Well, the same thing is true of John and of the plural noun tables. So you can have the John or you can have a John. We've seen that it's possible given the right circumstances, but you can also say the tables or some tables. So that would seem to argue that these words, the nouns, are neither definite nor indefinite. And if that's true, where does the definiteness of noun phrases like John and tables come from? One possibility would be to say that it comes from a determiner, and that determiner is there but is just not pronounced. When you say John, you really mean the John, the definite version of it, but you don't pronounce the. And simply with tables, you mean some tables rather than the tables. Now, this idea that something can be present but not pronounced is not unusual at all in linguistics. We find lots of cases where things that are just left unpronounced and yet are clearly still there. For example, in commands, things like get out, it's fairly clear that although you don't pronounce the subject of that sentence, the subject is certainly the person who's being addressed. When you say get out, you can't mean I get out or him over there get out. It means you get out. So there really is a subject there, which is a specific one. It's you, but it just doesn't usually get pronounced. You just say get out. Similarly, another case is what is known as ellipsis, where you simply leave out part of the sentence which is fairly obvious. For example, he wants to leave but I don't means he wants to leave but I don't want to leave. So you're missing out the final verb phrase want to leave because it's already been said in the sentence, and it would be rather repetitive to say he wants to leave but I don't want to leave. Okay, so you can miss out that. When you miss it out, however, it's still there. It still means what it means, and it cannot mean anything else. He wants to leave but I don't can't mean he wants to leave but I don't want to sail to America. It has to mean want to leave, and so we can see it's still there even though it's not pronounced. Well, the idea is that this is exactly what's going on with these single noun phrases. They actually are more than one word. They're a determiner plus a noun. It's just that you don't pronounce the determiner in these cases. Now, if this is true, then all noun phrases, or what we've been calling noun phrases, all contain determiners. Okay, so the man obviously has a determiner, Mary has a determiner that's unpronounced, and him has a determiner because the pronoun is a determiner. And what we see then is that all of these phrases contain a word obligatorily, and that word is a determiner, which would argue that that is really the head of the phrase. And if the determiner is the head of the phrase, these phrases are determiner phrases, not noun phrases as we've been calling them up until this point. Now, you might object that that sounds odd, to say that the determiner is the head of these phrases. And if that's what you think, then the reason that you think that is probably because you're not thinking about the notion head in the right way. The reason why most people might want to believe that the noun is the head of the phrase that we've been calling a noun phrase up until now is because they seem to see that the noun is somehow the more important word. Determiners are less important inside phrases. But what that's doing is looking at the notion head in terms of meaning. Certainly in terms of meaning, the noun carries the biggest weight here. It's the more consequential word. The determiner, semantically speaking, is of less importance. But the notion head is not a semantic notion, it's a syntactic notion. The head is the element that determines the category of the phrase, and category is a syntactic thing. It's to do with what element can appear in which position. It's not a semantic one. And just because something is semantically important doesn't necessarily mean to say that it must therefore be syntactically important. Syntax and semantics are in fact quite separate elements, even though there is obviously some connection between them. They are two different areas of linguistics, and what goes in one doesn't necessarily have to hold for the other. So we can actually see this in phrases that we've already looked at. Let's go back to our to London example. We argued that this is a preposition phrase, and therefore the head of this phrase is the preposition, and we can see that through distributional facts and replacement facts. This thing behaves like a preposition phrase, it doesn't behave like a noun phrase. And yet, if you consider the meanings of these two words to London, London is the most important semantic element there, okay? Even though it's not clearly the head of the construction. So we get lots of instances where something which is semantically less important is syntactically more important and is in fact the head of the phrase. So finally, I want to have a look at a kind of structure which is normally considered to be without a head, and that's the sentence. We've seen sentences consist of usually two parts: a subject, which is a DP, that's what we're calling, what we used to call noun phrases, but now we're calling them determiner phrases, followed by a verb phrase. And it's not entirely obvious that the sentence has a head. But X-bar theory says everything has heads, so we would expect sentences, just like any other kinds of construction, to have a head. Now, in order to try to go in search of what might be the head of the sentence, we have to look at some other versions of sentences. Another thing that a sentence can contain is something called a modal auxiliary verb. Verbs like may, or will, or can, or could, etc., etc. These things, when they appear between the subject and the verb phrase. So John may leave has a modal auxiliary between John and leave. Now note, whenever the auxiliary appears, something happens to the verb. When there's no auxiliary verb, as in John left, the verb is in the form left. When there is a modal auxiliary, the verb now changes to the form leave. Now the difference between these is to do with the absence and presence of tense. In the first case, John left, left is a tensed version of the verb. It's showing the past tense. Whereas in John may leave, leave is the tenseless version of the verb, what we call the non-finite version. Tensed versions are finite and non-finite ones don't have tense. Now, it seems that the appearance of the modal and the appearance of the tense are actually in complementary distribution, in as much as you can't have both of them together. You can't say John may left, where you've got a modal and a tense on the verb. Now, as we've seen, complementary distribution patterns would seem to suggest that the reason why the two things can't appear together is because they're trying to occupy the same position, and therefore they must be the same thing. Now, at first it seems a bit odd to claim that tense and modals occupy the same position, because after all, tense is something which appears on verbs. But if we look at this in a bit more abstract way, we can come to some form of understanding of what's going on here. If we assume that actually in a tense sentence there is something which is considered to be tense, and that it's that thing that is responsible for the form of the verb. So, for example, we might assume that there is some element, tense, that sits in exactly the same position as a modal auxiliary sits in. Okay, and that when it's present we have a tense form of the verb, and when it's absent we have a tenseless form of the verb. Okay, now this would then lead us to an understanding of why tense and modal auxiliaries are in complementary distribution, because whenever you have a tense, that sits in that position, and a modal auxiliary can't. Whenever you have a modal auxiliary, that sits in that position and the tense can't. Now, as both of these elements are sitting in the same position, they ought to be of the same category. Now, the category that has been suggested to cover both of these things, tense and modal auxiliaries, is called inflection, and is often represented by the letter I for inflection. So we can claim then that sentences are made up of a subject followed by an inflection followed by a verb phrase. Now consider a further kind of sentence. The sentence that I want us to look at here is that one that's in the brackets, John to leave. This is, in fact, a sentence, a kind of sentence. It has everything that sentences have. It has a subject, John. It has the verb phrase, leave, and it's got something in between them, this word to. This is known as an infinitival sentence, or an infinitive. It's a kind of non-finite sentence. As you can see, there's no tense on the verb, but it's specifically different because it contains this word to. Now, what is this word to? Well, the first observation to make is that this word is in complementary distribution with modals and with tense. You can't have both a to and a modal. You can't say, I want John to will leave, or you can't have a to and a tensed version of the verb. You can't say, I want John to left. Again, then, the complementary distribution between all of these three things would suggest that to, in fact, is an inflection, sitting in exactly the same position as the other inflections do. Note, to may look like a preposition. There is indeed a preposition to, but this isn't it. This is not a preposition, and you can see that by the fact that you cannot replace it by any other preposition. You can't say, I want John for leave, or I want John by leave, or I want John under leave. Nothing that is a preposition can go in that position. Therefore, this thing is not a preposition. It's just homophonous with a preposition. It has the same sound, but it's really a version of an inflection. Okay, so if that's true, then we've got all of these different types of sentences. All of them containing an inflection, a word element apparently, surrounded by the subject and the verb phrase. Furthermore, that element there is actually an obligatory element of the sentence. You cannot have a sentence that doesn't have some inflection in it. So a sentence that doesn't have a tense or a modal or a to would be just something like John leave, and that's not a grammatical sentence. So it seems then that the inflection, the word type element that sits in a sentence, is an obligatory element in that sentence, and we know it's the head which is the obligatory element in any construction. And if so, then this would seem to argue that if anything is the head of the sentence, it's the inflection. Therefore, sentences are actually inflectional phrases, phrases headed by the inflection. And again, if that seems odd to you, the reason for that is because you're thinking of the notion head in the wrong way. Head is a syntactic notion, and what we're claiming here is that the inflection is this important syntactic element, not that it's the most important semantic element at all. Often inflections actually don't play very much of a role in the interpretation of a sentence, but they do apparently play a huge role in determining the nature of the sentence. After all, we have a distinction between finite sentences and non-finite sentences. A finite sentence has a tense in it. A non-finite sentence has an infinitival element to in it. Okay, and other than that, those two sentences are exactly the same. They both contain the same subject, they both contain the same verb phrase, they just differ in terms of their inflection. And again, that would seem to suggest that the inflection is, in fact, the head of the clause. Okay, so clauses are inflectional phrases. Okay, now to summarise what we've said in this presentation. First of all, we have the basic claim of X-bar theory that all phrases have heads. Heads are words, and therefore every phrase contains a word of the same category as the phrase. Phrases can also include complements. A complement is a phrase that follows the head, and furthermore is actually determined by the head. So heads are actually the central element of phrases. They determine the category of the phrase by projecting the category of the word that occupies the head position up to the phrase, and they determine what complements and the nature of the complements that can appear inside the phrase along with the head through this notion of selection. Different heads select to have different complements. The other two things that we've argued is that determiners are the head of nominal phrases. These things are not noun phrases as we've been assuming up until now, but are in fact headed by determiners and therefore are determiner phrases. Finally, inflections are the heads of sentences, and therefore sentences are not headless constructions as they were once believed, but are in fact the same as any other kind of phrase. They are phrases that do have heads, and the head of the sentence is the inflection. Therefore, the sentence is really an inflection phrase, an IP. Okay, that's all I've got to say for this time, and I'll see you in class on Monday. Bye-bye.